हाँ, फिर इंडियन woods still fascinated European scientist Michael Faraday, the legendary scientist and discoverer of electricity and electromagnetism. He spent 4 years studying the properties of the Indian woods. 1818 to 2022. However, the woods still making process that was so widely known in South India was completely lost by the mid 19th century. Can you guess why this was so? The swords and the armor making industry died with the conquest of India by the British, and imports of the iron and steel from England displaced the iron and steel produced by the craft people in India. The abandoned furnace in the villages. The production of the woods steel required a highly specialized technique of refining iron. But iron smelting in India was extremely common till the end of the 19th century. In the Bihar and central India in particular, every district had smelters that used the local deposits of the ore to produce iron that was widely used for the manufacture of implements and tools of daily use. The furnaces were most often built of the clay and sun-dried bricks. The smelting was done by men while women worked the bellows. That is pumping air that kept the charcoal burning. Bellows क्या होते हैं? ये डिवाइस होता है इक्विपमेंट दैट कैन पंप द एयर. A village in the central India where the Agaris, the community of iron smelters, lived. Some communities like the Agaris specialized in the craft of iron smelting. In the late 19th century, a series of famines devastated the dry tracts of India. In the central India, many of the Agaria iron smelters stopped work, deserted their villages, and migrated, looking for some other work to survive the hard times. A large number of them never worked their finances again. ठीक है, फिर देखो, according to the report of the Geological Survey of India, iron smelting was at once time a widespread industry in India, and there is hardly a district away from the great alluvial tracts of the Indus Ganga Brahmaputra in which the slag heaps are not found. For the primitive iron smelter finds no difficulty in obtaining sufficient supplies of ore from the deposits that no European iron master would regard as worth his serious consideration. By the late 19th century, however, the craft of iron smelting was in decline. In most villages, the furnaces fell into the disuse and the amount of iron produced came down. Why was this so? One reason was the new forest laws that you have read about chapter 4. When the colonial government prevented people from entering the reserve forest, how could the iron smelters find the wood for charcoal? Where could they get iron ore? Defying the forest laws, they often entered the forest secretly and collected the wood, but they could not sustain their occupation on the basis for long. Many gave up their craft and looked for other means of livelihood. In some areas, the government did grant access to the forest, but the iron smelters had to pay a very high tax to the forest department for every furnace they used. This reduced their income. Moreover, by the late 19th century, iron and steel was being imported from Britain. Ironsmith in India began using the imported iron to manufacture utensils and implements. This inevitably lowered the demand for iron produced by the local smelters. By the early 20th century, the artisans producing iron and steel faced a new competition. Iron and the steel factories come up in India. The year was 1904. In the hot month of April, Charles Weld, the American geologist, and Dorabji Tata, the eldest son of the Jamsetji Tata, were traveling in Chhattisgarh in search of iron ore deposits. They had spent many months on a costly venture looking for sources of the good iron ore to set up a modern iron and steel plant in India. Jamshedji Tata had decided to spend a large part of his fortune to build a big iron steel industry in India. But this could not be done without identifying the source of fine quality iron ore. One day, after traveling for many hours in the forest, the Weld and Dorabji came upon a small village and found a group of men and women carrying basket loads of iron ore. These people were the Agarias, Agarias. When asked where they had found the iron ore, the Agarias pointed to a hill in the distance. Weld and Dorabji reached the hill after an exhausting trek through the dense forest. On exploring the hill, the geologists declared that they had at last found what they had been looking for. The Rajhara Hills had one of the finest ores in the world. But there was a problem. The region was dry and water necessary for running factory was not to be found nearby. The Tatars had to continue their search for a more suitable place to set up their factory. However, the Agarias helped in the discovery of source of iron ore that would later supply the Bhilai steel plant. A few years later, a large area of the forest was cleared on the banks of the river Subarnarekha to set up the factory and an industrial township Jamshedpur. Here, there was water near iron ore deposits. The Tata Iron and Steel Company TISCO that came up began producing steel in 1912. TISCO was set up at an opportune time. All through the late 19th century, India was importing steel that was manufactured in Britain. Expansion of the railways in India had provided a huge market for rails that Britain produced. For a long while, British experts in the Indian railways were unwilling to believe that good quality steel could be produced in India. By the time TISCO was set up, the situation was changing. In 1914, the First World War broke out. Steel produced in Britain now had to meet the demands of the war in Europe. So the imports of the British steel into India declined dramatically, and the Indian Railway turned to TISCO for the supply of rails. As the war dragged on for several years, TISCO had to produce shells and carriage wheels for the war. By 1919, the colonial government was buying 90% of the steel manufactured by TISCO. Over the time, TISCO became the biggest steel industry within the British Empire. In the case of iron and steel, as in the case of cotton textiles, the industrial expansion occurred only when the British imports into India declined and the market for Indian industrial goods increased. This happened during the First World War and after, as the nationalist movement developed and the industrial class became stronger. The demand for government protection became louder. Struggling to retain its control over India, the British government had to concede many of these demands in the last decades of the colonial rule. The Tata Iron Steel Factory on the banks of the river Subarnarekha 1940. The slag heaps. Slag heaps is a waste which is left when smelting metal. Expansion of the end of the war. To meet the demands of the war, TISCO had to expand its capacity and extend the size of its factory. The program of expansion continued after the war. Have you ever seen new power houses and the boiler houses being built in Jamshedpur in 1919? The early years of industrialization in Japan. The history of industrialization of Japan in the late 19th century presents a contrast to that of India. The colonial state in India, keen to expand the market for the British goods, was unwilling to support Indian industrialists. In Japan, the state encouraged the growth of industries. The Meiji Regime, which assumed power in Japan in 1868, believed that Japan needed to industrialize in order to resist Western domination. So it initiated a series of measures to help industrialization. The postal services, telegraph, railways, steam powered shippings were developed. The most advanced technology from the West was imported and adapted to the needs of Japan. The foreign experts were brought to train Japanese professionals. Industrialists were provided with the generous loans for investment by the banks set up by the government. Large industries were first started by the government and then sold off at the cheap rates to the business families. In India, the colonial domination created barriers to industrialization. In Japan, the fear of the foreign conquest spurred industrialization. But this also meant that the Japanese industrial development from the beginning was linked to the military needs. Civilizing the native, educating the nation. In the earlier chapters, you have seen how the British rule affected Rajas and Nawabs, peasants, and tribals. In this chapter, we will try and understand what implication it had for the lives of the students. For the British in India wanted not only the territorial conquest and control over revenues, they also felt that they had a cultural mission. They had to civilize the natives, change their customs and values. What changes were to be introduced? How were Indians to be educated, civilized, and made into what the British believed were the good subjects? The British could find no simple answers to these questions. They continued to debate for many decades. What is a linguist? A linguist is someone who knows and studies several languages. How the British saw education. Let us look at what the British thought and did, and how some of the ideas of education that we now take for granted evolved in the last 200 years. In the process of this inquiry, we will also see how Indians reacted to British ideas and how they developed their own views about how Indians were to be educated. The tradition of Orientalism. In 1783, a person named William Jones arrived in Calcutta. He had an appointment as a junior judge at the Supreme Court that the company had set up. In addition to being an expert in law, Jones was a linguist. He had studied Greek and Latin at Oxford, knew French and English, had picked up Arabic from a friend, and had also learned Persian. At Calcutta, he began spending many hours a day with Pandit who taught him the subtleties of Sanskrit language, grammar, poetry. Soon he was studying ancient Indian texts on law, philosophy, the religion, the politics, morality, arithmetic, medicine, and other sciences. Jones discovered that his interest was shared by many British officials living in Calcutta at the time. Englishmen like Henry Thomas Colebrook and Nathaniel Halhed, Halhed, were also busy discovering the ancient Indian heritage, mastering Indian language, and translating Sanskrit and Persian works into English. And together with them, Jones set up the Asiatic Society of Bengal and started a journal called Asiatic Researchers. Jones and Colebrook came to represent a particular attitude towards India. They shared a deep respect for ancient cultures, both of India and the West. Indian civilization, they felt, had attained its glory in the ancient past, but had subsequently declined. In order to understand India, it was necessary to discover the sacred and the legal texts that were produced in the ancient period, for only those texts could reveal the real ideas and laws of Hindus and Muslims, and only a new study of these texts could form the basis of the future developments in India. Henry Thomas Colebrook, he was a scholar of Sanskrit and ancient sacred writings of Hinduism. Madrasa क्या होता है? Madrasa is an Arabic word for a place of learning, any type of school or college. So Jones and Colebrook went about discovering ancient texts, understanding their meaning, translating them, making their findings known to others. This project, they believed, would not only help the British learn from the Indian culture but would also help the Indians rediscover their own heritage and understand the lost glories of their past. In this process, the British would become the guardians of the Indian culture as well as its masters. Influenced by such ideas, many company officials argued that the British ought to promote Indians rather than Western learning. They felt that institutions should be set up to encourage the study of ancient Indian texts and teach Sanskrit and Persian literature and poetry. The officials also thought that Hindus and Muslims ought to be taught what they were already familiar with and what they valued and treasured, and not the subjects that were alien to them. Only then, they believed, could the British hope to win a place in the hearts of the natives. Only then could the alien rulers expect to be respected by the subjects. With this view in view, as a madrasa was set up in Calcutta in 1781 to promote the study of Arabic, Persian, Islamic law, and the Hindu College was established in Banaras in 1791 to encourage the study of ancient Sanskrit texts that would be useful for the administration of the country. Monument to Warren Hastings by Richard West McCord, 1830, now in Victoria Memorial in Calcutta. This image represents how Orientalists thought of British power in India. You will notice that the majestic figures of the Hastings, an enthusiastic supporter of the Orientalist, is placed between the standing figure of a Pandit on one side and a seated Munshi on the other side. Hastings and the other Orientalists needed Indian scholars to teach them the vernacular languages, tell them about the local customs and the laws, and help them translate and interpret the ancient texts. Hastings took the initiative to set up the Calcutta Madrasa and believed that the ancient customs of the country and Oriental learning ought to be the basis of the British rule in India. Not all officials shared these views. Many were very strong in their criticism of the Orientalist. The grave errors of the East. Grave errors of the East. From the early 19th century, many British officials began to criticize the Oriental version of learning. They said that knowledge of the East was full of errors and unscientific thought. Eastern literature was non-serious and light-hearted. So they argued that it was wrong on the part of the British to spend so much effort in encouraging the study of Arabic and Sanskrit language and literature. James Mill was one of those who attacked the Orientalist. The British effort, he declared, should not be to teach what the natives wanted or what they respected in order to please them and to win a place in their heart. Aim of education ought to be to teach what was useful and practical. So Indians should be made familiar with the scientific and technical advances that the West had made, rather than with the poetry and sacred literature of the Orient. By the 1830s, the attack on the Orientalists became sharper. One of the most outspoken and influential of such critics of the time was Thomas Babington Macaulay. He saw India as an uncivilized country that need to be civilized. No branch of Eastern knowledge, according to him, could be compared to what England has produced. Who could deny, declared Macaulay, that that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. He urged that the British government in India stop wasting public money in promoting Oriental learning, for it was of no practical use. With a great energy and passion, Macaulay emphasized the need to teach the English language. He felt Their knowledge of English would allow the Indians to read some of the finest literature the world had produced. It would make them aware of the developments in the West in science and philosophy. The teaching of English could thus be a way of civilizing people, changing their taste, values, and culture. Following Macaulay Minute, the English Education Act of 1835 was introduced. The decision was to make English the medium of instruction for higher education, to stop the promotion of Oriental institutions like Calcutta, Madrasa, Banaras Sanskrit College. These institutions were seen as temple of darkness that were falling of themselves into decay. English textbooks now began to be produced for the schools. Orientalist, those with a scholarly knowledge of the language and culture of Asia. Munshi, a person who can read, write, and teach Persian. Vernacular, a term which is generally used to refer to a local language or dialect as distinct from what is seen as a standard language. In colonial countries like India, the British used the term to mark the difference between the local languages of everyday use and English, the language of the imperial masters. Education for the commerce. In 1854, the Court of Directors of the East India Company, London, sent an educational dispatch to the Governor General in India, issued by the Charles Wood, the President of the Board of Control of Company. It has come to be known as Wood's Dispatch, outlining the educational policy that was to be followed in India. It emphasized once again the practical benefits of a system of European learning as opposed to the Oriental knowledge. One of the practical uses the dispatch pointed to was the economic. European learning, it said, would enable the Indians to recognize the advantages that flow from the expansion of trade and commerce and make them see the importance of developing the resources of the country. Introducing them to the European ways of life would change their taste and desires and create a demand for the British goods. For Indians would begin to appreciate and buy things that were produced in Europe. Wood's dispatch also argued that Europeans' learning would improve the moral character of Indians. It would make them truthful and honest and thus supply the company with civil servants who could be trusted and depended upon. The literature of the East was not only full of grave errors, it could also not instill in people a sense of duty and a commitment to work, nor could it develop the skills required for administration. Following the 1854 dispatch, several measures were introduced by the British. Education departments of the government were set up to extend the control over all the matters regarding education. Steps were taken to establish a system of university education. In 1857, while the sepoys rose in revolt in Meerut and Delhi, universities were being established in Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay. Attempts were also made to bring about changes within the system of school education. The Bombay University in the 19th century. William Carey was a Scottish missionary who helped establish the Serampore mission. The demand for moral education. The argument for practical education was strongly criticized by the Christian missionaries in India. In the 19th century, the missionaries felt that education should attempt to improve the moral character of the people, and morality could be improved only through Christian education. Until 1813, East India Company was opposed to missionary activities in India. It feared that the missionary activities would provoke the reaction among the local population and make them suspicious of the British presence in India. Unable to establish an institution within the British controlled territories, the missionaries set up a mission at Sirampur in an area under the control of Danish East India Company. A printing press was set up in 1800 and a college established in 1818. Over the 19th century, missionary schools were set up all over India. After 1857, however, the British government in India was reluctant to directly support the missionary education. There was a feeling that any strong attack on the local customs, practices, beliefs, and religious ideas might enrage the native opinion. The Sirampur College on the banks of the river Hooghly near Calcutta. What happened to the local schools? Do you have any idea of how the children were taught in the pre British times? Have you ever wondered whether they went to schools, and if there were schools, what happened to these under British rule?